Done. Let's see, go live. We're going live soon.
Awesome. Exciting.
Hey everyone, my name is Kajal and Ashley and Kaylee are joining us today for the live. If you can hear us, do drop it in the chat below so we know that the audio and video is good to go. Okay, let me just double check.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, yes, we are live. So
Yay.
Kaylee and Ashley, also known as SisterCodes, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. So great to be here.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll just intro ourselves really quickly. Ashley, if you want to start. Yeah, so I'm Ashley. I'm Ash Codes on Instagram, and I'm a mobile software engineer at a bank here in the US. I graduated in July of 2020, so very recently, and then started a job. And yeah, I run SisterCodes with Kaylee, which is a podcast and a YouTube channel. Yes, so my name is Kaylee. I also work in fintech. I'm a software engineer. I've been working full-time about 2 years, and I guess especially relevant to this video, I've actually been interviewing over the last year. My team was expanding, we were looking to hire, so I've actually been conducting interviews myself, and then Ashley really recently has been doing the interviews herself, so we're here to kind of share our perspectives on what we think during a technical interview, like both from the perspective as like myself as an interviewer and then Ashley as an interviewee. And we're really excited to talk to you all about technical interviews.
And we are super excited to have you here. Kaylee has come on my channel before.
Yeah.
So make sure all of you give lots of love to SisterCodes. I've included all of their social media handles in the description. And their newest adventure is YouTube. So make sure to subscribe to their channel and also to my channel.
Subscribe to everything.
And I also wanted to say, if at any point anyone has a question, just drop it in the chat. Put hashtag questions so it's easier for me to see, and we'll take them as they go. We also have some pre-submitted questions that we'll ask them at appropriate time. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, so I guess I already touched a little bit on our background with technical interviews. So before we dive into like our advice and stuff, I think we're just going to kind of talk through what to expect in case you've never done a technical interview before, you've kind of just heard about it and you're trying to familiarize yourself with what is a technical interview. Yeah, so it really varies, but the first stage is probably going to be like a really short phone call with a recruiter, probably like 30 minutes or so. And they're just going to talk through like your resume, try to understand like what you're interested in, things like that. And they'll just see if you're kind of like a good fit for the company. And then if you get past that initial phone stage, then you're going to move on to have a technical interview. So it could be like a coder pad, that type of interview. So you're just going to be typing on a screen. Sometimes it's not even an IDE. They just want you to bring up like a Word document or something and then just type out the code yourself. If it was in person, it'd obviously be like an actual whiteboard and you'd be drawing on it. But nowadays it's going to be online. And you can have multiple ones of those, I feel like, maybe like 2 or so. And then yeah, you might have even like a more specific interview. Like, for example, since I'm a mobile software engineer, I had specific ones on like Android in particular. And so those were additionally like on top of the other ones. So yeah. Yeah. And I think overall technical interviews are, unless there's something more specific, like something for mobile programming, there's typically a focus on data structures and algorithms. And then you could even have something like a system design or system architecture interview. And I've seen them mostly split up between those two kinds of technical interviews for general software engineering roles. Obviously, if you're like a data scientist, there might be something more specific like database design or, maybe like even a real world example involving like a lot of big data. But I think typically if you're applying for a general software engineer position, you should definitely expect to have a really big emphasis in the questions that are asked to you on both data structures and algorithms. Yeah. So I know Kajal also just had a session about how to prepare for a technical interview. So you all, if you have questions about that, definitely go check that out. I'm sure you've got it linked, or it's easy to find on her channel. But we want to talk a lot about like the interview itself, like what to actually expect when you show up. I guess show up now is dial into a virtual interview now, right? Things have changed a little bit. So we really want to share like our perspectives from both sides about during the interview, some of the best tips and practices. So
before we go further, so as you guys as the two of you mentioned, now the interviews are happening more online. So are there any tips specifically for Zoom calls or Skype calls or Google Meet, whatever is being used?
Yeah. Number one, I'd say is make sure that you turn on your video if you can. It really is so hard just talking to like some voice. So I think if you can, make sure you turn on your video, make sure that you are there and like ready 10 minutes before. So you're not like scrambling to get on the Zoom call if like there's technical problems, like make sure you're ready for that.
I also think there's a couple things you can do in advance to help you prepare. And that is really just to have your setup very well set up. So find a space with good lighting, preferably with like a window or something facing your face, and then a nice like neutral background behind you. It also helps to eliminate any stress about somebody walking behind you or opening a door or something like that. So it's a good idea to like spend a little bit of time to find a nice quiet spot with a good internet connection. I also, one of my personal tips is to put a sticker right next to your webcam so that it feels like you're making eye contact with the interviewer rather than looking somewhere else on your screen or looking at yourself, because sometimes that can actually pull your eyes away and it might look like you're gazing off into the distance during your interview, which, you know, it's kind of difficult, just the same as if you were in the room with someone to get that kind of personal connection. So maybe print out like a picture of your favorite celebrity and like stick it right next to your webcam. I always say to do like a Ryan Gosling meme that says like, you got this girl, like, it, you know, with the, one of those. So, you know, that's one of the things I always recommend. And then of course, headphones, like you want your hands to be free, even if this is like an over the phone call, but then you're sharing your screen on a coder pad, you want your hands to be free so you can be coding or like writing things down and drawing out diagrams. Make sure that you get like some kind of headphones set up so that you've got clear mic, you know, good sound, and that you're not stressed about those things during the interview so that you can really focus on the questions that are being asked and things like that. So, you know, spending a little bit of time to just prepare your setup in advance can just really help your confidence and make you a lot less stressed about the technical issues that could come up during a virtual interview. So yeah, I think those are a couple of tips if you have like a Zoom interview or even an over the phone interview, honestly.
Yeah, that's a great trip. I'm going to try that. You know, I have a little meme that supports me and takes a little bit of the pressure off.
Exactly. And it's nice because you have something to look at and it kind of reassures you and comforts you, and it'll maybe take some of the nerves off. So yeah.
And then I know next we wanted to talk about how to use the whole interviewer aspect to your own advantage.
Yeah. So Ashley, do you want to talk about from your perspective first?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess what I want to talk about is like, it can feel kind of scary and it can feel like the interviewer is kind of intimidating. Sometimes you'll get interviewers who are really nice and like warm and friendly, but you can also get interviewers who are just very like stoic and you can't really tell what they're thinking. But the interviewer is really there to help you. Like they want to help you showcase yourself in the best possible way. They're not going to try and trip you up. Like if you ask them questions, they're not going to mislead you. Like they're trying to help you. So just try and remember that they are just a person, you know, and they're just trying to see if you are the best fit for, you know, the company. So yeah.
Yeah. And so from my perspective, there's, you know, obviously you don't want to be like too friendly, warm and nice. I mean, you want to like definitely put people at ease, but even sometimes as an interviewer myself, I'll just be quiet and let someone think. But it is important to remember, I'm never trying to purposefully trip somebody up. I'm never trying to trick someone. I'm never trying to, you know, like make this an awful experience. In fact, it's the opposite. As an interviewer, I can only imagine how stressful it is to be in the other seat, having been there myself. So sometimes, you know, you're really there to observe and see things kind of unfold. That being said, I think there are a lot of ways to use your interviewer to your advantage. And that's what Ashley was kind of touching on. So talking out loud is a very big one. Like, I guess, so for you, what are some ways that you've actually used your interviewer to your advantage?
Yeah, so okay, so just talking about talking out loud for a little bit. I think it's so important when you're going through a problem to be talking about why you're making certain choices. So like if you're using a certain data structure, say why you're using it. Or if you're using like a certain algorithm, say I'm using this because it's the most optimized or whatever, as compared to something else. And I think it's actually really difficult to do that, to make sure that you are like saying all this stuff out loud. So I actually recorded myself when I was doing technical interviews, and I made sure that I made sense when I was going through a problem, because it's not natural at all. You're just thinking about it all in your head. But yeah, also on that point, like make sure that you're asking good clarifying questions to your interviewer, because that will also help you a lot. It won't, so if you ask a bunch of good clarifying questions, then you can narrow down the problem, and then you won't go off on like a bunch of different tangents when you shouldn't be. So yeah.
And it's extremely helpful from an interviewer's perspective to have people talk out loud, because you can catch people before they go down rabbit holes.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important piece. So if you're asked this really complex question and there's multiple different implementation approaches, like just say all of them, like maybe just write them out. And that way you can most likely get a hint of like, maybe this is where you should start, rather than just starting where you think is the most obvious. Because like Ashley said, like I don't know what you're thinking. So I don't know that you've realized, oh, there's 5 ways to approach this, and I'm going to start with 1. But if you tell me, then I can actually help you and say, oh yeah, that's awesome that you considered these 5 different directions, but hint, hint, nudge, nudge, why don't we start with number 3? Because I think that's actually going to, take us to a better place in the interview, and it's going to allow you to showcase your skills. So it's super important to kind of be overthinking out loud, so that you can be providing the interviewer with all of the information, all of the thoughts that are running through your head, so that not only do they know that you're thinking it, but also they can help you prevent making some mistakes, which might actually put you into a tougher spot later on. So I guess it's about like keeping all of your options open and making sure, very similar to how you code in real life, you are always considering different options, and then you kind of pick one and go down that path, right? So you want to mimic the same approach to how you would code an assignment or a homework piece or anything like that, right? So you just want to make sure that they get a glimpse into what's happening in the inner workings of your brain, because it's hard, and it's hard to assess a good engineer, and understanding that process is really, really what lets someone like me know, oh, this is how you think, this is how you approach a problem. So that's super, super important.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. As
yeah.
you said, it's even if you get a wrong answer, that's fine. At least the interviewer know that you thought of that answer.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I think that's like one of the things that I think about, like while I'm taking notes and I'm going through, if I'm assessing somebody on, for example, like a coder pad. So it's like a standard question. What's cool is that I've seen dozens of people answer the same question. So I'm like fairly familiar with all the different implementation and approaches. And I'm always looking for a couple of really critical things. And whenever somebody really goes to over communicate, it also shows me that they have good communication skills. So it's like, it goes to show that the technical interview does way more than just assess like what data structures you know and what algorithms you know, and like if you know how to write a Lambda in Java, right? Like it goes so much beyond even those coding related things. It shows a lot about like, how resilient are you? Like when you run into a roadblock, like what do you do next? Or do you ask questions? Like, do you clarify with me before you start writing code? Or, even things like, do you know how to communicate what you're thinking to me and be able to have a little bit of a dialogue? Because I will say there are some people who just say, okay, and then they just start coding and it's completely silent. And then I have to follow up and say, do you want to explain why you made this choice, right? And like I kind of try and prod them along, which by the way, if that happens, it's definitely an indication that you need to spend more time explaining out loud what it is that you're thinking. I've had to do that several times before, where someone's just like a black box. It's like they've taken in this input of a problem and they're just writing code, but you have no idea what's going on in their head and how they're thinking about things. So it's so important to like be really vocal during the interview.
Yeah. All right. So I want to ask one of the pre-submitted questions. As an interviewee, can I bring my notes to the interview? And is it okay to do that?
Yeah. So I think it definitely depends. Obviously, when we were having like in-person interviews, I don't think so. I think it is a little bit strange to bring like notes to an interview, but as we are moving into this like Zoom world, I think people do have notes up, you know, like on the side. Sometimes if you don't have like your elevator pitch down all the way, or you want like certain keywords to remind you of things you want to talk about yourself, that could be good to have. Also, if you are going into something very specific, like I went into mobile in particular, I was actually asked to prepare stuff on Android, like some notes on Android questions and topics. And so I did that and I had it up, but it's because like I was asked to do that. That was like part of my interview. But yeah, I think it like I said, it kind of depends. But I definitely don't think that you should be coming into an interview with like pages of notes, you know what I mean? And just like reading from it, because that's not natural. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think it depends. I think if it's something like a leak code problem where you're doing some kind of data structure algorithm question, I would lean towards no. And that's really because sometimes notes can distract you from the interview. And I've noticed that as well, where you can tell when someone's like reading off a screen, for example, or if someone's trying to Google something while they're talking. It's pretty obvious from the perspective of an interviewer, and it can definitely impact you negatively rather than you just saying, you know, like, oh, I'm not entirely sure about this piece. But that being said, I think certain kinds of notes are definitely encouraged. For example, if you have any questions that you want to ask the interviewers, like I really welcome when people have done their research and brought really good questions. I know you did this as well, where you have like a list of things that you want to ask people in like that 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the interview. So I think bringing those kind of notes are really great, because it definitely shows that you've done your research, that you have spent the time really like thinking about the company or about the role, and that, you know, you just want to make sure you don't forget it with the stress of the interview going on. So yeah, I mean, if it's going to be like the O of N runtime of sorting algorithms kind of notes, I would say no, you should probably spend the time to like learn and memorize those things ahead of time. But then if it's things like, oh, questions that you want to prepare, or like Ashley said, notes on your elevator pitch, I think those kinds of notes are totally fine to bring to an interview. And I don't know, for me, at least, the questions piece is definitely encouraged. I like it when people ask me good questions.
Yeah. And, you know, another thing that Ashley said was great, that even if you are doing notes, make sure you're using only keywords and not sentences. Otherwise, you'll end up spending too much time just reading and not answering the question.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
So this leads us to our next pre-submitted question. What kind of clarifying questions do interviewers look for when the interview is presented with the problem?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I love that. I think the first thing is, like, even before clarifying questions, is just to take the pause to ask questions shows a lot about you. I really like it when people ask to clarify things about the scenario that's been presented. So for example, are there any like memory constraints or runtime constraints that I should consider? Or, you know, how many users is this intended for? Do I need to think about scalability? Do I need to think about handling the load of like 1 million requests, right? Depending on what your problem is. It really helps for me when you're asking questions that not only help set up the bounds of what it is that you're expected to implement, but also when you're thinking about the user experience. I actually find those kind of questions to be super helpful, because it shows that you're thinking really critically about the problem and about, okay, in this hypothetical situation, right? Like, how would this impact the user? So asking those kinds of clarifying questions, I always like, because it goes to show that you're thinking really carefully and that you're trying to get as close to an optimal solution on the first pass. Obviously, iterating is great, but sometimes interview times just don't allow for it. So it's helpful when you ask those questions up front, and then it can steer you away from certain choices, and you can kind of explain why you would choose one implementation over another based on information that you receive from those questions. I also think that asking any clarifying questions are good, because a lot of times these questions that you're presented are meant to be really vague, because they want to test if you're going to ask a question at all. So like, you know, even if you can't think of like the most amazing question, just showing that you take that pause and that you are following it up with some kind of question is good. Sometimes that is the test in and of itself. So, you know, I think that there's almost no bad questions you can ask when you're in that clarifying stage.
That's awesome and very interesting that, you know, sometimes the questions are vague. So make sure to ask questions.
Yes. Yeah. And it also, I think it shows that you are willing to kind of, it's not like pushing back, but almost it is, right? It's like, wait a second, you know, why are we doing this? You know, people want to work with people who are going to question motivations and like reasons behind decisions. And I think that that's one of those ways you can demonstrate that you're a person who thinks really critically about things instead of just taking something and running with it without asking anything, right? So I think it's a good test of that.
Nice. So we do have one interesting comment from our audience here.
Mhm.
From Dana Script saying, yes, asking questions can really open up a conversation about things that matter to you.
Yes,
Yeah.
love it. Hey, Dana Script.
Yeah.
We know her over from Instagram.
Yeah. Hey.
All right. So we do have another question from audience as well. It's from Aftab Naeem saying, does small talk help in an interview? Like to show your communication skill, or is it an indication that the interviewee is overdoing it?
Okay, so I would say in the beginning, like in the initial part where you're like, hi, how are you? All that stuff. I think it is good to have like a little bit of small talk and a little bit of communication because it kind of humanizes both of you, I feel like. But I have read a lot of stuff, or I did read when I was doing my technical interview prep, that you shouldn't be too specific. Like, for example, you shouldn't come on and be like, I love the Yankees or something, because like what if they hate the Yankees, you know what I mean? Like don't say stuff like that that's too personal, if that makes sense. But I think a little bit of small talk is good at the beginning to like make you all both more comfortable.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate it. I think it helps to break the ice. It helps to kind of put everybody at ease. And, you know, at the end of the day, you're two people having a conversation. So I think it is good. But yeah, like Ashley said, refrain from really controversial topics. So like sports teams or even like straight up politics, you know, anything like that, maybe tabs or spaces, because that can be hugely controversial. You know, anything that's like could maybe create like a negative impression of you before the interview's even started. But yeah, I like it when people have a little bit of small talk, or at least maybe ask you like, how's your day been, or how's your week been, or sharing something small like, you know, it's snowing outside and I'm so excited for the snow. I don't know, small things like that I do think help. And it also, like you said, it helps you to get to know a candidate beyond just the questions that you ask them during the interview. So you can get a lot of like an impression of somebody from that small talk that you have. So I think it's not a bad thing, but definitely keep it to either the first 5 minutes or the last like 5 to 10 minutes.
I was just gonna say it should be like 5 minutes. Like it shouldn't be longer than that. It should be rambling. Yeah,
because otherwise then I'm thinking, why are you having so much small talk? Are you trying to hide something from me? Like, are you trying to distract me somehow? So don't make it so forced that, you know, your interview is thinking like, why are you telling me about your dog? Right? Like just let it be natural, and you can definitely read the room a little bit to like decide how warm the response is and if you want to like continue with it or not.
Yeah, totally.
But good question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
All right, we have one more from our audience here by Michelle A. How do I ask for feedback on my performance in the interview for future improvement? Do I ask it right away or wait until I send a thank you note? I really love this question.
Yeah, I do too. What did you do?
I did it afterwards, but to be honest, like I didn't really ask for feedback unless the interview went negatively. I realized I probably should have asked for feedback if it went positively, because then I would learn more about myself. But yeah, it was usually like if I did get an email and they said like, oh, you know, we're not going to be moving forward, I'd say like, thank you so much for the opportunity. Like, is there any feedback that you could give me? Some companies just straight up will not respond to you, but if they do, you know, it's obviously great because then you can build on that and you can improve where they said, oh, like maybe you need to be stronger here or something like that. But what about you?
So first of all, I love this question because I've definitely done the same thing and asked for feedback before. Usually it is when it's like, oh, you know, you're a great fit. However, we've chosen not to move forward. So I'm like, oh, if I can have some feedback, that'd be great. Right. Now that I've been interviewing though, I do kind of understand. So there's a lot of legal implications with giving feedback from interviews, which is why it's so tricky. Because like on the one hand, I do love it when people ask because it shows that you want to improve yourself and it shows that you're looking for a way to like iterate on your performance and you have a growth mindset. So I think asking it is definitely a great move at the end of an interview. But I will say from like my perspective, I can't usually give feedback because it could be misconstrued as like a reason for not hiring a candidate that might be completely unrelated from the actual reason. So we've actually been advised not to give any feedback, because you don't want to, like, you basically don't want to give somebody a reason to like sue you, because you could say something that they could misinterpret or take the wrong way. And maybe what you gave as feedback had nothing to do with the reason why they weren't hired, but it can put you in a really tricky situation. So like when you go through all of the training to be an interviewer, they advise that you don't give feedback. So I will say, like, asking for it doesn't hurt, but kind of be prepared to hear like some very generic, like, oh, you should follow up with our HR, or, you know, something that kind of redirects you, and don't keep pushing, because then that can also reflect poorly on you. But yeah, I think it's better to ask, like, either in the thank you follow-up or right at the end of the interview, like when you say, or when they say, are there any questions you have for me? I think that those are like your two windows to
I feel like it can also put people on the spot though, like interviewers, because then right away they have to be like, oh, what did they not do well in the interview? You know, because they're like so focused on like taking notes about you and all this stuff. So it might be nicer after a little bit, you know, and then you send the thank you and you say like, what's any feedback you give me?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've had it both ways. So I mean, I can't share feedback either way, so I haven't felt too on the spot, because like, I can't say anything. But yeah, no, that if they can give feedback, I think you bring up a good point about it being after the fact, when they've gotten a little bit of time to like review their notes and process.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. But either ways, you know, either at the end of the interview or afterwards, feel free to ask. Even if you don't get a response, it still shows that you're someone who has a growth mindset.
Yeah, totally. Definitely. I think asking is a great way to show that you have a growth mindset, even if the answer is like, well, sorry, we can't we can't give you any feedback, but you get points for asking the question, so it doesn't hurt to ask, regardless of whether it went well or didn't go well. So totally.
Yeah. And I think that kind of puts us into our next pre-submitted question is, what do you do if you can't answer most of the questions? So I'm guessing it's, you know, if your interview is going downhill, what's the best thing you can do? It sucks, but, you know, you are in that situation. How do you try to either salvage it, or what's the best you can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all been there. Like, we had that one very bad interview where it's just like so uncomfortable. You don't know the answers. I would say that if it's just like a little bit, I don't know, it says most of the questions. So just, I don't know, be comfortable with saying like, I just don't know that well. I think that also helps your interviewer, because nobody knows everything. So, you know, it's okay to say like, oh, I don't know how to do this, but I don't know. What do you do if you don't know all of the questions?
I've been in both sides, right? Like, I've been in an interview where I just didn't know most of the questions. I will say though, admitting that you don't know stuff is not bad. It's better than just like making things up or pretending to know things you don't.
Don't do that. Yeah.
So like, this is like entirely true experience. I interviewed at like a very large tech company. I had an interview over the phone in which I was asked rapid fire, like very short questions, super pertinent to like syntax and very small details of programming that I'd never been asked in an interview before. I probably said, I don't know. I don't know what that is, or I don't know, to like 6 out of 10 of the questions that was asked, and I still got an offer. So for whatever reason, they must have just really appreciated my honesty and the fact that I said like, oh, I don't know that, but I'm going to go look it up. Like, I'm going to write it down. That's what I basically said. And I was like, could you explain to me what that is? Like, I want to learn. So I tried to make the most out of it when I realized, hey, this is not going well at all. Tried to make the most of it. And I tried to ask them to explain it to me, because I said I wanted to learn what it was, but I admitted that I didn't know what it was right off the bat. There were questions like, you either knew it or you didn't. There wasn't really much of a way to demonstrate that
I don't like those kinds of questions, first of all.
I agree. I agree. But if you find yourself in that situation, like, I mean, I basically said I don't know, and I still got an offer. So I guess something worked there. I will say, if from like my perspective, when somebody doesn't know like the answer to a question, which I guess for me, it would probably, like, from the interviews that I've done, it would be like, you can't get to an optimal solution, or you can't reach a solution in a coding problem or in a system design problem. Admitting that you don't know is not a bad thing, but also I'm not always trying to figure out how to, like, what the solution is, right? Because I've seen the question like a million times. It's not like it's new to me. Sometimes what I really want to assess is like, how do you think? How do you work through a problem? How do you work through a roadblock? Because I've had some people who get into an interview, realize that they can't solve the question, and just freeze. They don't try anything. They don't talk to me. It's like 5 minutes of utter silence with no key, like hands on keyboards, or they'll just say, I'm stuck, and expect me to kind of like give them a hint. What I actually appreciate more is someone saying, wow, you know, I don't see an obvious way to solve this, but how about I write some pseudocode to just get the test case, like a brute force approach to just solving the one test example that the problem's given you. Those two approaches are so different, right? It goes very quickly from like, I'm stuck, I don't know how to solve it, like I'm done, I've stopped trying, to actually demonstrating, look, I actually don't know how to solve this problem, but I can at least solve for this one example case that I've been given, right? And let me at least write some pseudocode, and maybe that will help jog, you know, my brain into seeing this problem in a different light, and maybe I'll kind of stumble across the solution. I think one of the qualities you want to demonstrate to an interviewer is resiliency, right? You want to be able to show that if you get stuck or faced with a problem that you don't know, which honestly, my job happens all the time, right? Like as a coder, you're constantly faced with problems and questions that you don't know the answers to. So you want to be able to demonstrate to a potential employer that you're not just going to get stuck and not do any work, that you're going to be able to be creative and proactive and try and like find different ways to solve a problem. So I guess it's like, just keep in mind the skills that are actually being assessed during an interview. Like if everybody could just memorize every leak code problem, we wouldn't do technical interviews, right? Like there's no point to it. Some of it is like demonstrating that engineering problem solving process and how you respond in different situations. So yeah.
I totally agree with that. It's okay if you don't know, just ask or say I don't know. I've been in interviews where it just went really, really bad.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I think it's like you have to get like one bad experience before you start getting
totally
100%. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all had those interviews where you're just sitting there and you're sweating and you know don't know the answer and like you don't know what to do and there's like 45 minutes left and you're just so stressed out. But you know, make the most of it. I've also just straight up said, I know this isn't going well, I'm really stuck, can you help walk me through this problem so I can at least learn it? I've also done that. And then it turned into more of like a coaching session where the interviewer like coached me through the problem, but it really helped me. So I was like, okay, you know, at least I took something away from that. But
I feel like there's also, like you were talking about earlier, there's a huge difference between interviews where it's just like rapid fire questions and then between like actual coding ones. So I feel like actual coding ones, I mean, you know how to code. I mean, if it's a very technical one. And so just remember, like, you've solved problems before. This is just another problem that you need to solve. And yeah, like Kaylee already said, talking about all the different potential ways that you could solve it, even if you don't think any of them are right, you might as well just say it. You might as well just be like, oh, I think maybe it could be this and this solution. And then maybe they'll help you. And then maybe you'll get back on track. You never know.
Yeah. Okay, so we have one more question from the audience. It's from Arju Goyal. The question goes, sometimes the HR is the one arranging the interview and the interviewee doesn't know who's going to interview them beforehand. How do you contact them for feedback then?
That's a good question. Email HR, ask for their email address. That's my tip. Because like, it's true. I think most of the time you won't get the email address of whoever interviewed you. If they don't offer it to you, like if it doesn't come up in the course of the interview, then you can always reach out to HR and say, hey, I would love to drop a note to whomever I interviewed with. If you could please share their email address, I would really appreciate it. Alternatively, and I've had some candidates do this, they'll drop me a note on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I was gonna say LinkedIn.
So that's also another option. If for some reason maybe they don't give you their email address or something like that, you should have their name from the interview.
Yeah. Okay, so that actually brings us to the question, you being an interviewer, how do you feel when you get a message on LinkedIn?
Oh, okay, that's a good one. So for me, it depends. I mean, obviously a lot of it depends on like how excited I was about the candidate, because if it's someone I'm really excited about, that's like a really awesome opportunity to kind of sell them on the role or the company. It depends on how it's done. I think as long as you're really thoughtful about the fact that, like, I mean, for the most part, you still are a stranger and you're just really considerate and you're not like expecting anything from them, then I think that's totally fine. I actually really appreciate it when people do send follow-up thank you notes, because at the very least, it's like an hour out of your day that you could have been working or doing other things that you spent to talk to a candidate. So it's really nice when people reach out and say, hey, thanks so much for the time. I really enjoyed chatting with you. Like, could we stay connected on LinkedIn? Like, I really don't mind it when people reach out with those kinds of things. I think it's different if you're like expecting something from that person. Like, hey, it was great to talk to you. Could you please do this thing for me on, on LinkedIn? I think there's a big difference. Yeah. So it's like one kind of opens up the door for like that like relationship, that connection. But then the other one kind of expects something of the interviewer. So I think as long as you're just being really mindful of the fact that like they took the time out of their day to interview you and you're just being really respectful of like that boundary, then it's totally fine to reach out to them.
Awesome. So one of the other pre-submitted question was the candidate was asking help with SQL and Python preparation. Do you have any resources to share?
Yeah, we were talking about this actually because, Kajal shared these pre-submitted questions with us in advance and we were like, oh, SQL and Python prep. And yeah, so what did you do to prep for like your more specific Android level interviews, like your Android focused interviews?
Yeah, well, basically I like already knew Android Studio and all this because I did my dissertation in it. But I think it's really helpful just to go through and you can go on places like, what is it, Tutorials Point? Is that what it's called? And there'll be like an overview of different Android topics that you should be able to go through and like you should know, a little bit about each one at least. I think it's, if you really don't know anything about like SQL and Python, then it's really good to go on places like Codecademy and just do like a really basic course on it. I think that also really helps. Yeah.
I also think that just using those languages to solve other problems is super helpful. So there's a lot of sites, for example, LeetCode, LeetCode, HackerRank, they'll have questions for specific languages. Because I think different languages have different utilities, right? SQL or SQL, that's definitely used for database retrieval. So what you're usually trying to get data out of a database, right? For a relational database specifically, or you're trying to create a table or something along those lines. Python is like a scripting language, right? It's not object oriented, although you can kind of have objects, but it's not really meant like Java, like you don't have a bunch of different classes. A lot of times you're writing really short scripts or short methods. So for both of them, I think it's important to practice them in the context of the questions you're going to be asked. So for SQL, practice getting stuff out of a database. Practice, on LeetCode or HackerRank, some SQL problems. It'll probably be things like, write a select statement where you select these pieces of data with some kind of condition attached to it, right? So get familiar with the syntax and understanding how the language works, which goes back to Ashley's point of like Tutorials Point, or just learning really like Codecademy level basic utilities of the languages. And then, beyond that, if you are still in school and you have an opportunity to complete like a class assignment, try and do it in the language that you're prepping in. Like, I just think the more practice, the better. So if you know you're going to interview in Python and you've got like a big assignment coming up, try and write the whole thing in Python, because you're probably going to learn like different libraries, different imports, and things that you will come up in the course of naturally coding that could really help you in an interview, and will also show that you have a pretty deep understanding of the language. I think every language has kind of like its little quirks, I guess is the best way to say it. And like even with different levels of Java, like different versions of Java have like their own quirks to it. So the more of those things I think will really help present you as an expert, since you spent time like learning the language, coding in it. And I mean, honestly, practice makes perfect. So the more time you spend coding in a language, like the more you're going to know about it. So that's always a good way to go.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. That actually brings me to a very interesting question that I've been asked before. So I'll ask you, Ashley, first, and then I'll ask Kaylee. How do you feel about asking in an interview when you're stuck in a syntax and you can't remember the syntax?
Like, what do you like? I don't know.
Like in a coding question, you're supposed to write a coding answer, and then suddenly you just can't remember the syntax. Like you have to write a for loop or something, and you just can't remember the syntax. How do you feel about asking in an interview?
I honestly wouldn't probably ask. Like, I would probably just try and write it like as best I can. Or you could just be really honest and be like, I am blanking completely on this, but I know that this is about what it's supposed to be. But I don't think I would ask them. I don't know. I think I'd just be like a little bit too awkward about it.
Which is why I wanted to ask Kaylee. So now give us your perspective. If a candidate suddenly says, hey, I don't remember the syntax for writing for loop. How do you feel about that, getting that from a candidate?
So It depends. For example, I had someone who tried to solve a problem using comparators, and they couldn't remember the exact syntax for like declaring the comparator, which that I was like, honestly, I don't even remember it, right? Like I'd probably have to Google it myself. So it's like, if it's something where you would normally in the course of your day Google it, I think it's not too bad to say, look, normally I would Google this. I can't remember the exact syntax, but this is the rough pseudocode of how I remember it being declared. And then a lot of times, I mean, first of all, it depends on the interview. Like if your code needs to compile, then you should definitely ask like, hey, you know, I might need a pointer, or would it be all right if I look up the syntax for a comparator, because I've written this pseudocode, but I know it's not going to compile because it's not correct. But then if it's also like, if you're just having a total brain fart and it's something that you should know how to do, like kind of like Ashley said, just try and get as close as possible, and like maybe you'll remember, and like you'll get a compiler error, but it'll at least buy you a little bit of time to like go back and fix something. But yeah, I think that it like goes to show that practicing coding in that language that you're going to be interviewing in, especially leading up to a technical interview, is super, super important. Because even for me in my day-to-day right now, I've been using Kotlin and not Java. So like if I was to go and interview, I would want to go and do a lot of coding in Java just to refresh myself on the syntax of a particular language. But yeah, that's a tough situation to be in, because the reality is, if we don't know something on our day-to-day, we just look it up, right? Like we don't feel the need to memorize every piece of syntax. I think really basic things like how to retrieve a variable, how to declare a method, those kinds of things you should definitely be able to remember. But if there's something really niche and specific, like writing a Java Lambda function and you forget the exact syntax of it, I don't think that's like the biggest deal.
I also feel like in a lot of my interviews, they say beforehand, like the syntax doesn't have to be perfect. They'll just say it like they just say, you don't have to have the perfect syntax, just, you know, pseudocode, and then explain to me what you're doing. So
I think it's definitely trending that way. But if your code has to compile, excuse me, if your code has to compile, then you might want to ask for a hint, because
or you could like write it out and then be like, I'm not sure this is the exact syntax, like, you know what I mean, but at least show that you are somewhat there.
And honestly, depending on what the syntax is related to, sometimes I've had people like actually implement functions. If they can't remember, like somebody couldn't remember like math dot, you know, greatest common denominator for a Python function. And they said like, oh, I can't remember. I can't remember that. And I was like, okay, but if you were to write that from scratch, like how would you write it? And then they actually implemented it from scratch. So then it didn't matter about the fact they couldn't remember the syntax, but it was like, goes to show that they knew how to work through the problem of like, let's say Google disappeared and you still had to code this. Like, how would you approach it? So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but kind of a couple different approaches.
Just a couple of different approaches. Like you said, right? Let's say, for example, I'll give you my experience in Python. If I'm interviewing someone and if they can't remember the syntax for loop, it's going to be a little tricky, because I'm like, you're going to be always writing for loops. So then that means probably not coding that much. But if it's something like operator overload or some really complex functionality of a class, and you don't remember the exact syntax, then it's fine, because it's a rarely used functionality and it's okay to look it up. Like I'd also say, let's look it up and here's the syntax and then continue. But if it's something basic, then it shows that you aren't coding enough.
Yeah, definitely. Agreed. Yeah, if it's something basic, it's a bit of a red flag where you're like
an if else or something.
You should kind of know how to do that, right? Like,
yeah. And then I know now let's start talking a little bit about how to follow up after an interview, or at the end of the interview, what kind of questions to ask and stuff like that.
All right, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so talking about questions to ask, I find it's really helpful if you do know your interviewer's name beforehand to go and look them up on LinkedIn, and then kind of just look over and see what they've worked on at the company, so that you have some questions to ask them around that. So if they've worked on something you're super excited about, then you can ask them specific questions about that, and then they will be like happy to answer them. I feel like that is something that really impressed my first interviewer at the place that I'm working now, because I had gone on his LinkedIn and seen what he had been working on, and he was like, that was a great question, and then he like dived into it because obviously he'd been working on it. So yeah, good questions to ask. What type of questions do you like getting from interviewers?
For me, the biggest litmus test of a good question to ask someone, can it be Googled? If the answer is yes,
oh yeah,
do not ask it.
Don't ask like really basic questions about the company or anything like that. They should be specific. Yeah.
Yeah, or something about culture or that person's experience working there that you wouldn't be able to get from a simple Google search. So for example, one of my favorite questions actually to ask in an interview, like when I'm interviewing for a place, is what would you change about fill in the blank company? Because that's like a really good way to understand like what are the challenges of working somewhere. I also love asking people, what's your favorite thing about working at blank? I usually ask both those questions and like right next to each other, because first of all, if they can't figure out their favorite thing that they like about where they're working, that's a bit of a red flag to somebody who's interviewing.
It's definitely happened before. I've had like interviewers where I'm like, oh, what's the best part of your job? And what's the most challenging part? And they're like, oh, the most challenging part is like all these things. And then the best part is like,
and then they're just silent.
They're like, I enjoy working with the people or something. It's like very basic. So yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. So I mean, I like getting asked those questions. I also like getting asked things that are relevant to the company I'm working at that time. Like, let's say we've made a really big announcement about some new software that we're launching or a big project that's getting started. I love it when people ask me those questions, because it just goes to show that they've done their research, that they're like really interested in learning more about like how this new project would affect me, or how excited am I about a new thing that we're trialing out. I like things that show people have researched and familiarized themselves a little bit with the company. So even if it's not specific to me, if it's really specific to the company that I work at, then I really appreciate those kind of questions. I think they just show a lot of thoughtfulness on the part of somebody who's interviewing, and you definitely get bonus points for asking good specific questions at the end of an interview, for sure.
Nice. Yes, indeed. It's when it's generic, the same goes for even messages you get on LinkedIn, as Kaylee mentioned before. If someone says or asks something very generic, you're not even excited about answering it. You'd be like, when someone says, oh, how to write a good resume, be like, there's so much online research about it. But if you ask something really specific, for example, I'm in the field of robotics. So if someone asks me, hey, how do I write a good resume for a computer vision role at a robotics company? I can get behind that, because I know it's not a very common Googleable question. So the same goes for interviews, right? It's somebody's taken a day or hour of their time and they're, with you. Asking those good questions kind of shows you that, oh, okay, this is someone who's putting the effort and will also put the effort in the job.
Exactly. And I think that's really what goes to that's really where you can set yourself apart at the end of an interview, especially if it's one of those like preset coding interviews where there's not a lot of room for natural discussion to come up about like the company or about what you've done. So really consider those last 5-10 minutes of an interview when you can ask questions as the time to like pitch yourself to whoever's interviewing you, because that's really where you'll get to show like how excited you are about a role or a company. So it really does pay off if you invest the time to prepare that in advance.
Yeah. So we do have another question or I would say a comment from the question, which a comment from the audience, which can be converted into a question. That when, as you mentioned, research your interviewers beforehand and the company itself. As an interviewee, it can get a little like you feel a little weird, because the other person will get notified that someone saw their profile, and based on their LinkedIn premium subscription, they can also see who saw their profile. So how does it feel from the interviewer perspective to see that, okay, this person checked out my profile?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, I don't have LinkedIn premium, so I just get the like 4 people have viewed your profile. So it doesn't really give me too much information. Even if I had LinkedIn premium though, I don't think it's a bad thing that you're researching somebody ahead of time. I actually feel like it could be a good thing.
It shows that like you are motivated, that like you want to know more about the person who's going to be interviewing you and see what their experience is. I feel like that's good.
Yeah. And I think too, because whoever's interviewing you should get your resume ahead of time, so they should be able to familiarize themselves with you beforehand. So it's nice that you kind of get a chance to do the same.
Both ways,
So like I wouldn't be too worried about it. I mean, if you're really bothered, you can always use incognito mode a lot of times LinkedIn will give you like a very brief overview before you have to log in, and it won't like, since you won't be logged in incognito mode, it won't actually show that you viewed as yourself. So I mean, that's just a small tip if you're really that concerned about somebody seeing you looking them up on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, it shows that you've done the research. I mean, I appreciate if someone's gone through my profile, and then that way I know that the questions they're asking is something specific. So it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely how I feel.
Yeah. All right. So now also let's talk about what kind of thank you notes to send or follow-up messages to send after the interview.
Yeah, I think it's always important to send a thank you. Like Kaylee said, it is a person that's taking like an hour out of their day. It doesn't have to be super long. You can just say like, thank you for interviewing me. Like, it was so great to talk to you about this. And like, I look forward to hearing next steps. That's also great to put at the end, just like as a little remember me. But yeah, I think it's important after every single interview that you have to send a good thank you note.
Yeah, I get very few thank you notes as an interviewer, and it takes a lot of work to interview somebody. Not only is it time out of your day, but you also, I mean, first you need to like go through and like learn about the candidate and go through their resume. But you know, even during the process, sometimes you're skipping a meal to fit in an interview, depending on the timing, or you're waking up early, or you're staying on late because it pushes other work aside. So it's definitely, it can be a challenge, and it can be really like tiring to interview a lot of people. So it's nice when people reach out, they say like, thank you for your time. I think that just goes, that one phrase goes above and beyond to say, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate talking with you. And my advice is, if you can find one thing that made your conversation with them unique, try and mention that in the thank you, because it just goes to show that you didn't take like a generic template and then send it to them. You said like, I really appreciate you telling me about your experience on this team, right? Or even just something that like a question you asked, like tailor it to that conversation that you've had with the person. And it'll also just come across as like you've put in that much more effort and thought into writing that thank you and sending it. But definitely always send the thank you. I think it does nothing but help you. So make sure you follow up, and you know, whether it's on LinkedIn or if it's like an email, like just drop them a note and say thanks so much for your time. I really think it's awesome, and I love getting them because I feel so like appreciated. I'm like, oh wow, like they took the time to say thank you. Like that's so kind of them, right? So like it definitely makes me smile when I get those kind of thank you notes. So definitely send one.
Yeah, very true. Definitely send a thank you note. What about follow-ups? Let's say you had a good interview, you sent your thank you note, and it's been a week and you haven't heard back. Or how often do you think the follow-ups should come in?
Yeah, I think a week. That's a good amount of time. I feel like if you haven't heard anything in a week, you can just follow up and but don't be like aggressive about it. You can just be like, it was great to talk to you last week. Just wondering if there are any next steps or anything I should be looking for, like something simple like that, I feel like.
My advice is also, if you're going to follow up, it's best to follow up usually with your HR contact or recruiter first. And then if you don't get a response, it's maybe you slipped through the cracks and you know that your application kind of got lost in a shuffle. And then maybe you should reach out to somebody who interviewed you and say like, hey, I haven't heard from my recruiter, fill in their name. Do you know if there are any next steps or anything else I need to do? And then maybe internally, that person could reach out to the recruiter for you and say, look, this person reached out to me saying that they haven't heard any updates. Sometimes it's just as simple as like a mistyped email address, right? And sometimes there's other things that happened behind the scenes. But I think if you're trying to follow up on your application, reach out to your HR or recruiter contact first. And then if you don't hear, I think it's fine to follow up with an interviewer that you sent a thank you note to. But your HR person should still be your first point of contact. Yeah.
All right, we have one more question coming in from Arju Goyal. The question goes, how soon to send the thank you note?
I don't know.
Right away.
Right away? Oh, okay. Well, not I usually wait like an hour.
Yeah, so, okay.
I was like, not like right after.
Sure, like you don't need to have it queued up and then ready to send.
Yeah, but definitely do it, pretty soon, because otherwise you will forget about it. It's just like natural to forget about it. So yeah, within the day, I think that's good.
I think, I think up to like 48 hours, because things sometimes do get busy, but I think up to
It doesn't-
48 hours.
It
is
shouldn't
good.
be like a week later. You're like,
Yeah.
thank you for your time. Like they're will have forgotten about you, I feel like, already.
I once saw a meme that said a thank you diminishes for every like 24 hours after the event has passed. It
Oh my
diminishes in
gosh.
half. So you could think of it like an exponential curve, like reducing in like thankfulness as the time passes.
That's so funny.
But I mean, that's a little bit extreme. I mean, I think roughly within 48 hours is a good time frame, but you should do it as soon as you can.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the question that person expanded, like right away after the interview, or should we wait for a while? I think at least take an hour, because then otherwise,
Yeah.
'cause I personally feel after I have done an interview, I need at least 15 minutes to breathe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, you need to get water, you gotta go to the bathroom, you gotta get a snack, right? Like you need to just kind of like deep breaths. Yeah, I think an hour is perfect. Yeah.
Okay. I know we had one other pre-submitted question, which was a little out of bound, but it would still be fun to get your perspective on it. The question went, for senior roles, any advice on negotiation?
Yeah, so Kaylee and I talked about this beforehand because we were like, just senior roles, it should be all roles. So I am like a junior dev, and I negotiated my offer. I really think that at any level you should be negotiating your offer. It is
I'm just going to
expected.
interrupt for 1 second. So
Yeah.
on their podcast, Sister Codes, we do an episode on negotiation. I'll try to find and link it in later. Do check it out, but also continue.
Yeah, we did do a whole
We
podcast.
did do a whole podcast episode on
because
this.
it's honestly, it's very intense. I had never negotiated really before, but yeah, they expect you basically to negotiate. So usually what you do, if we're talking about like negotiating salary, is you ask them for a range first. And then if they don't really want to give it to you, then you just kind of ask again in a more polite way. But then if they really won't give you a range, then you can go in with your range and you say like, I'm looking for this to this based on like market value and all these different factors. And then negotiations will start from there. But yeah, you should always be negotiating. You should never accept the first offer.
Yeah, I think the big thing to keep in mind is that the company or the recruiter, whoever's hiring you, their job is to try and pay you as little as possible as they can get for you to accept, right? But you need to have the opposite intention. You need to be getting them to pay you as much money as you can get them to pay you for like, right, to have the job. So you need to know that that's what their intentions are. You need to know what your intentions are. And then also remember that like negotiating is a very back and forth process. So you need to build in a little wiggle room, right? Like Ashley said, try not to answer any questions of like, how much would you like to be paid? Because you usually undervalue yourself. So try and do a lot of market research. Try to ask them for a range so you know what the preset budget is. Like most times if you ask people, the range that they get is higher than what they would have asked for themselves, which is why it's really important to ask that question. And then also if they don't tell you and you do need to give a range like Ashley was talking about, try and ask for higher than what you actually want, because remember, it's a back and forth. So if you want to end up on, I don't know, $100,000, don't say you want 100,000. Should say you want 110,000. So it gives you that wiggle room for them to say, oh, well, we can't do that. And then you come back and then go back and forth. I will also say with negotiation, and not just for senior roles, like all roles, there's more to negotiate than just salary. There's so many things you can negotiate on. There's pay time off, 401k matching, there's education, like tuition reimbursements if you want to go and do like additional schooling or professional certifications. Start date is a really big one. That's the one that I personally negotiated on. So I pushed back my start date by about 8 months so that I could go and travel the world, which like I do not regret. There's also things like sign-on bonus or relocation stipends, and then also like year-end bonuses. So there's so many things that you can negotiate and an offer. So just think about what's important to you and like pick those things and then use those to negotiate. I'll also say it always helps to have competing offers if you are looking to negotiate with a company. My big thing is though, like, don't waste people's time. Don't negotiate with all 3 companies. Negotiate with the one you're most excited about. And use the other 2 offers to leverage, because you're going to really tick people off if you negotiate with all three of them and they give you like amazing offers and then you decline. So you don't want to like burn bridges while you're negotiating in the process of negotiating.
Yeah, so you like pick your very favorite one, and then you basically just negotiate with them, and then you say like, oh, I have offers from these other people, and maybe you say like their range is this. Yeah, it's actually funny that you said that, because you said that companies' range is usually higher, but the place that I work at now is lower. And so I said, oh, actually my range is a little higher, and then we negotiated up a little bit. But also you should be happy with the lower end of your range. So make sure that that's a number that you're happy with. So yeah, if it's like 100 to 110 or whatever, make sure that you would be happy with 100 and not just 110.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, like Kajal said, we have a whole episode on SisterCodes. We can send her the link so she can put it in the description. We have a whole episode that we talk about negotiating because we're so passionate about it. Honestly, like negotiating is where so much of the gender pay gap comes from, because historically women have not been taught how to negotiate, and so they don't ask, they just settle for whatever offer they're given. And then you see, especially the more senior you get, like these massive differences in how much people are making. Just remember that like moving forward at a company, like even if a sign-on bonus is really big, all your raises are probably going to be done based off of your base salary. So that's super important to consider, because if you're getting a 5% raise on like the base, that's different from like your bonus plus your base for your first year. So that's also just something to keep in mind, like if you're thinking about your long-term career at a company and you're negotiating your first offer.
I feel like we could talk about this forever.
I know,
literally did
we
for
so
like 30 minutes on the
it's,
podcast. Yeah.
It's a very dense topic to dissect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. And do check it out. It's actually a really good episode. So the next question I have for you is, what are some of the things that people have done that have really stand out to you, given you've done all of these interviews, or things, you know, that you said that you find that, oh, don't ever do that?
Well, I think your question that you asked like definitely made an impression, because you looked somebody up on LinkedIn.
No, 100%. He was like, that was an amazing question. And like, I can talk so much about this and all this stuff. And I think it really did help me. Yeah. But yeah.
So for me, oh, wow. I think things that really stand out are when people are very like, you can tell when somebody's being honest about something and when somebody's trying to like evade things. I like it when people are very candid during an interview. I really appreciate that kind of honesty. Like when you ask a tough question to them and they're very honest with you, that really impresses me, because I like to work with people who are forthcoming and upright and honest. I also think when people not argue, I guess that's the wrong word, but when people like push back on something I say, oh, like, why would that be the better way? Like, wouldn't this actually be a better solution? I also like that as well, because it shows that somebody's assertive and they're willing to ask questions. So I like it when people don't just assume like, oh, you're the interviewer, I must say everything to please you, and they tiptoe around. I like it when people kind of come in much more like you would at work, which is to like ask questions, be a human, I guess is kind of like what I'm getting at here. So I like when people have, been really honest with me and transparent or level set with me, or even just asked me a really tough question and said like, hey, I know this is a really tough question to ask you and I'm putting you on the spot, but I want to know about this. Those kinds of things. It's like in the back of your head, you're always asking yourself, would I want to work with this person? Would I want to buddy up with them on a project? Would I trust them to like go and complete something if I give them an assignment? You want the answer to be yes. And those kinds of actions kind of show that you would be a great person to work with. So I think anything that falls in that category is a great way to sell yourself to whoever you're interviewing with.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is, in a technical interview, there is a behavioral aspect, even if it doesn't seem like it. Because like even I have conducted interviews, and sometimes as an interviewee, you think, okay, I can bullshit my way out of this, and the other person, but you can see it. Like, I think when you're preparing for an interview, sometimes just take someone else's interview so you actually get that experience, what it is seeing from the other side, because you can see through people a lot of times.
100%. Yes. You can read between the lines. You can kind of stitch together whatever the response is. Like, we're all like pretty smart human beings. Like we've got, we can kind of figure things out. You've got that like spidey sense or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, it will become it'll become very apparent to somebody who's interviewing you. So just, be a human. Like, don't try and be some perfect you don't have to be perfect, right? You just need to be human. You need to be somebody who the interviewer feels like they can trust. And I think that's super important.
Yeah, so we're almost coming to an end. I just want to say thank you to both of you for taking an hour of your time and coming on this channel and giving all of these really amazing tips. And I also want to tell our viewers that 2 weeks from now, we have another session where I'm going to be talking. I have another guest speaker coming in and talking about how to network as an introvert.
Oh, that sounds like a good
one.
one. That's an awesome one.
Yeah, thank you. So before we go, are there any last minute tips that you want to share with our audience? And also don't forget to go show some of this love to their YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that I can think of is like, it's still a numbers game. Practice makes perfect. So the more interviews you do, we're just the same person. It's a numbers game. Practice makes perfect. The more you can do technical interviews, the less scary they'll feel, the more confidence you're going to have, and you're going to kind of unlock that like secret sauce. It's a very formulaic approach to technical interviews, and sometimes it just takes you a little while to get in the groove. So don't be put off by a couple of bad interviews. They happen to everybody, like every person.
I feel like you need to have some of those bad ones, but and you'll start like recognizing patterns in the interviews and the questions and things like that. So yeah, I agree 100%. It is a numbers game sometimes. You just have to apply to as many as possible and then get the interviews, do them, get the practice, and eventually you will get a job.
Yeah, it's a bad interview is rite of passage.
It really is. 100%.
It is. It's horrible, but it just is part of the process,
Necessary.
right?
Yeah. So once again, thank you so much. And thank you for this lovely audience for giving such amazing questions and for staying with this session. I really hope you all got some amazing tips, and make sure to follow my channel as well as SisterCodes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see if I can